You are about to listen to a snippet of the Terra Incognita podcast. For the full episode, please click on the Patreon link below. Okay, thank you very much. Imagine for a moment that someone could delete your memories. Let's imagine that your whole adolescence was deleted. Would you still be the same person? In some sense, yes, you would still have the same genetic makeup, you would still look like you, and you would still sound like you. You would retain many of the same inclinations and abilities. But in a deeper sense, your identity would be profoundly altered. This is because our memories, especially those from our formative years, shape our beliefs, shape our values, and perspectives. They contribute to our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. This is why people often choose to repress or modify certain memories. What does this have to do with history? I think that history is to a people what memory is to an individual. Just as memory shapes and guides an individual's understanding of themselves, history provides a framework for a people's cultural, social, and political consciousness. This is why history has always been a politically charged discipline. Who we remember and what we remember shapes who we are as a people. Historians are not merely chroniclers of events, they are cultivators and custodians of collective memory. They shape a people's political and national consciousness. This is why history has always been subject to political control. This is perhaps best explored in Orwell's book, 1984. Orwell explored the relationship between politics, history, and collective memory in this novel. Winston, the main character, works in the records department, where he specializes in the falsification of written material. He manipulates and destroys historical documents that don't align with the party's propaganda. He helps the party continuously rewrite the historical narrative. The party does this because they recognize that they can shape a people's perception of themselves by doing so. The party in Orwell's 1984 was, of course, based loosely on the Communist Party, who manipulated history in a similar way. Upon taking power, they removed an equestrian statue of Alexander III, and they also got rid of statues of Tsars, princes, and generals. In Moscow, fire trucks with ladders and crews went around the town with iron hooks to tear off the Romanov eagles. In the capital, revolutionaries hunted down imperial emblems. Crowns and eagles were torn from gates and fences, and even blown out with dynamite in some places. After the October Revolution, there were almost none of these symbols left to deface or destroy. Places, things, and institutions were renamed to honor new heroes. Petersburg became Leningrad, sirs and madams became comrades. The revolutionaries did this because they understood that in order to create the new Soviet man, they had to destroy everything that had previously existed. That is why in 1918, the revolutionary Alexandrovsky said, "Blow up, smash to pieces the old world, in the heat of battle of the universal struggle, by the glow of flames, show no mercy, strangle the bony body of destiny." This insight didn't just occur to communists. Every revolutionary group throughout history has understood that a statue is not simply a piece of heritage. It is an exhortation to think, feel, and behave in a certain way. These exhortations to live up to old ideals need to be destroyed to make way for new ideals. This is why, after the outbreak of the English Civil War, parliamentarians stormed Winchester Cathedral and fired shots at a bronze statue of Charles I. It is why a statue of King George III, located in New York City, was torn down by a group of American revolutionaries in 1776. It's why French revolutionaries decapitated the 28 statues of kings that stood in Notre Dame. It is why they converted that cathedral into a temple of reason, dedicated to enlightenment and revolutionary ideals. And it is why, in our own time, people seek to tear down statues of explorers.
A heavy police presence has protected a statue of Captain James Cook in Sydney's Hyde Park as colonial monuments are toppled and vandalised around the world. Officers were seen circling the statue during last night's unauthorised Black Lives Matter protest. It remained under guard until after demonstrators had dispersed.
Yes, there's a growing pressure to tear down statues of explorers like Cook and Flinders. Eventually, I believe they will try and rename cities. Already, it's common for people to refer to Melbourne as Nam. And I noticed the other day when I was on a flight, they actually put the name of the city, like Sydney, and then they'll put the indigenous name next to it. So this is well and truly already underway. In 2021, the government funded ABC referred to Australia Day as Invasion Day. So you can see we are already undergoing a sort of soft cultural revolution. I say soft because nobody's being killed, but the same revolutionary tactics are being employed. And they're highly effective because we as a people have come to view ourselves in a totally different way. We are absorbed by self-hatred. We view our history as a long list of crimes. A significant number of our people believe that Cook is a criminal. A significant number of our people believe that we shouldn't be here, that the British colonisation of Australia should not have happened. How can you defend a country if a significant number of your own population don't think you should be there? The answer is, of course, that you can't. Unless we reevaluate our attitudes towards the past, we won't have a country. I believe that this self-loathing is something that has to be overcome, and I believe that we can only overcome it by changing our attitude towards the past. We can shape our future and sense of self by changing our attitude towards the past. We need a different attitude towards the past, a different attitude towards the future, and a different attitude towards ourselves. That's what we need. And that's what I'm going to try and promote in my own small way with this podcast. The first topic that I want to talk about on this podcast is the discovery of Australia. It will be a number of episodes. I'm not yet sure how many. I know it will be at least 5 episodes, but most likely it will end up being more. But after listening to this series, I hope you have a different attitude towards Australia. I hope that you have a different view of Cook and the other explorers that discovered this nation. And who knows, maybe you'll have a different attitude towards yourself and your own people. Now, there are people who will straight away take issue with the title of this episode. They'll say Australia wasn't discovered by the Europeans, it was discovered by Australian Aboriginals. In front of me, I have an article by the state-sponsored Australian Broadcasting Corporation that does exactly that. The title of this article is, "It is a damaging myth that Captain Cook discovered Australia." In this article, the author, Stan Grant, discusses the Captain Cook statue that is in Sydney's Hyde Park, the one that people attempted to vandalise. That was what the recording was about that I played earlier on. The inscription on that statue says, "Cook discovered Australia in 1770. Grant, a popular Aboriginal journalist, takes issue with this inscription. Here's what he says. I'm quoting the article now. "History itself becomes a hymn to whiteness. This is what Captain Cook's statue in Sydney's Hyde Park tells us. The inscription that Cook discovered this territory, 1770, maintains a damaging myth, a belief in the superiority of white Christendom that devastated indigenous peoples everywhere." He finishes off this article by saying, "We have a voice, our lives matter. After all, we discovered this territory." And when he says we, he is referring, of course, to Aboriginals. Now, in a sense, he is absolutely correct. The true discoverers of these lands were much earlier generations of migrant peoples. The first inhabitants of Australia probably arrived overland or by island hopping from Southeast Asia more than 50,000 years ago, at a time when sea levels were much lower than at present. Nobody would deny that Aboriginals were the first to settle in Australia. But here's the thing, they lived in separate tribes. Before the Europeans arrived, there were 500 to 600 tribes in Australia who spoke different languages. The Aboriginals, as we know them today, a national group with a common identity, did not exist before European contact. They are a product of the European invasion, which brought different tribes together under the umbrella term Aboriginal, which is, of course, a Latin word. They are not an ancient people, they're a very modern people. Before the invasion, they did not have a common name or shared identity. They regarded each other as enemies. They did not have a notion of the continent as a whole or of their relation to the rest of the inhabited globe. They came originally from Asia, but by the time the Europeans arrived, they believed, as some still do, that they had been created in Australia. So it seems fair to me to say that Europeans discovered Australia, because Australia really didn't exist as a concept before them. Australia wasn't a continent or a country, but a collection of diverse and separate indigenous tribes with distinct language, cultures and territories. Basically, Australia wasn't a country or a continent, it was hundreds of different tribal territories. The notion of a unified Australia, as we understand it today, did not exist prior to European exploration. The indigenous peoples did not have a shared identity or a collective name for the entire landmass. But I certainly do think the inscription on Cook's statue is exaggerated. Australia was not discovered by one man or even one nation. It was a transnational project that occurred over 2 millennia. To understand the discovery of Australia, we can't just talk about one man or one nation. We need to talk about the European age of discovery and Western civilization more broadly. For most contemporary Australians, the European history of the southern continent prior to 1770 remains obscure. They know about Captain Cook, they know about Matthew Flinders, but they don't really know the other European explorers that made the discovery of this country possible. And that's what I'm going to try and bring to light in this podcast, the contributions that other European nations made to the discovery of this country. I'm going to try my best to make this history clearer. Europeans have been interested in Terra Australis for many centuries. Indeed, interest dates all the way back to ancient Greece. Now, I will admit, I chose the topic with some reluctance. According to my YouTube analytics, 90% of my audience is American. Now, how many of those people are going to be interested in learning about the discovery of Australia? I suspect the number is very few, but the reality is you're not just going to learn about the discovery of Australia if you sit through and listen to these episodes. You're going to learn about the age of exploration more broadly. Someone who wanted to learn about Europe could read a history of Europe, or they could read a history of France. France's history is so inextricably linked with Europe's that you can't really understand its history without also understanding what's going on in Europe. The Reformation, the fall of the Roman Empire, the Renaissance. These pivotal moments that started elsewhere in Europe profoundly shaped France's intellectual, cultural, and political landscape. You can't understand France without understanding Europe. In the exact same way, you can't understand the discovery of Australia without understanding the age of exploration more broadly. The discovery of Australia was not an isolated event. It was a part of a larger movement that saw Europe discover, colonize, and conquer the globe. That is why I'm going to talk about ancient Greek astronomers and mathematicians on this podcast about the discovery of Australia. That is why I'm going to talk about Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese Empire, the Spanish Empire, Tasman, and the Dutch East India Company. I'm going to talk about these men because our history is inextricably linked with theirs. Without them, the history of this continent is unintelligible. The great epic of Australia's discovery does not begin with Captain Cook. It begins, as so many other great European stories do, with the ancient Greeks.